July 2nd, 1955. According to a story that has fascinated people for decades, a Pan Am passenger plane took off from New York, heading toward Miami. On board were dozens of passengers and crew members. Everything appeared normal until the aircraft supposedly vanished. No crash, no distress call, no confirmed wreckage. The plane had simply disappeared. The story claims that Flight 914 was expected to arrive in Miami after a few hours, but it never reached its destination. Controllers could no longer track the aircraft. Families were left waiting, and eventually, the flight was supposedly declared missing. For decades, there was no explanation for what had happened. Then comes the strangest part of the story. According to the legend, 37 years later, an aircraft suddenly appeared near Caracas, Venezuela. Air traffic controllers watched as an old passenger plane approached the airport. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but when they communicated with the pilot, the situation became completely bizarre. The pilot reportedly asked the controllers, "What year is this?" The controllers were shocked. According to the legend, the pilot believed it was still 1955. He apparently had no idea that decades had passed. The passengers inside the aircraft were supposedly just as confused. But then something even stranger happened. The story quickly became one of the internet's most famous aviation mysteries. Some people suggested that Flight 914 had somehow traveled through time. Others believed it could have involved a wormhole or some unknown phenomenon. But there was one major problem. Was Flight 914 ever real in the first place? The story of Flight 914 sounds like one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. A plane disappears in 1955, then somehow returns decades later. But when investigators started looking for evidence, they found something very different. The first major clue wasn't inside an airport. It was inside a newspaper. In May 1985, an American tabloid called Weekly World News published a story titled Riddle of Flight 914. The article claimed that a Pan Am Douglas DC-4 had disappeared after leaving New York in 1955. It supposedly carried 57 passengers and crew members. And after decades of being missing, the aircraft was said to have appeared again. According to the article, the aircraft eventually appeared near Caracas, Venezuela. An air traffic controller supposedly saw the strange aircraft on radar. The plane then landed, and according to the legend, the pilot seemed completely confused about the date. But there was a major problem with this story. There was no independent evidence confirming that any of it had happened. Fact-checkers later searched newspaper archives and official aviation records. They couldn't find credible contemporary reports about a missing Pan Am Flight 914. Even the supposed photograph of the aircraft had problems. It wasn't actually a photograph of a mysterious Pan Am plane. It was a stock photograph of a DC-4 belonging to another airline. And there was another strange detail. The newspaper later republished the same story in 1993 and 1999. But even the photographs of the supposed eyewitness were different. Two different men were presented as the same air traffic controller. Suddenly, the mystery wasn't looking like a time travel event. It was looking like something else entirely. A story that had been created. According to the legend, the story jumps forward to 1992. At Caracas International Airport in Venezuela, air traffic controllers were watching the skies like any normal day. Then suddenly, an unidentified aircraft appeared on radar. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual, but as the aircraft came closer, controllers noticed something strange. It looked incredibly old. The aircraft was supposedly a Douglas DC-4, a type of plane associated with the 1940s and 1950s. The control tower tried to establish communication. Finally, the pilot contacted them, and according to the legend, the pilot asked a simple question: "Where are we?" The controllers reportedly gave him their location, but the pilot seemed confused. The pilot reportedly told the tower that the aircraft was supposed to land in Miami on July 2nd, 1955. For the people inside the control tower, that made absolutely no sense. Nearly 4 decades had supposedly passed. The controllers were now looking at an aircraft that, according to its own pilot, had just started a normal journey from New York. Then came the question that supposedly changed everything. Do you know what year it is? According to the legend, the pilot finally realized that something was terribly wrong. Ground crews were reportedly preparing to assist the aircraft. But instead of remaining at the airport, the pilot suddenly became frightened. He started the engines again, and the mysterious aircraft supposedly took off once more. Just moments later, it disappeared from the story as mysteriously as it had appeared. But if this incredible event really happened, where was the evidence? There was supposedly one strange clue left behind at the airport. A small calendar was said to have fallen from the aircraft before it disappeared again. For years, this tiny object was presented online as the only physical evidence of Flight 914. But when investigators looked deeper, even this part of the story had problems. If Flight 914 really disappeared for 37 years, there should be evidence. A photograph, an official report, a record of the aircraft, or at least a witness whose story could be verified. But when researchers began examining the famous Flight 914 story, the first piece of evidence started falling apart. One of the most famous images connected to Flight 914 shows an old Douglas DC-4. For years, the image was presented as the missing Pan AM aircraft. But a reverse image search revealed something very different. The photograph was actually a stock image of a DC-4 wearing the colors of Trans World Airlines, or TWA. Not Pan AM, not Flight 914. Then researchers looked at another important character in the story. His name was supposedly Juan de la Corte. He was described as the air traffic controller who witnessed the mysterious aircraft. But something didn't make sense. When the story was republished years later, the photograph supposedly showing Juan de la Corte had changed. And the man in the photograph was different. The investigation went even deeper. Researchers searched for official aviation records and credible news reports, but they couldn't find evidence of a Pan AM Flight 914 disappearing in 1955. The flight was also absent from U.S. Department of Transportation records covering aircraft accident investigations from that era. If a commercial aircraft with dozens of people had truly disappeared, there should have been a massive paper trail. And suddenly, the mystery started looking very different. There was no verified missing aircraft, no confirmed disappearance, no reliable witness, and no evidence that a plane returned 37 years later. The entire story could be traced back to one source, Weekly World News, a tabloid famous for publishing extraordinary and fictional stories. So if Flight 914 never really disappeared, why did millions of people believe it? That's where the story gets even more interesting. By now, the evidence was pointing toward one conclusion. Flight 914 wasn't a real, unsolved aviation mystery. It was a story created decades ago. But if the story was fictional, how did it become so famous? The answer begins with something surprisingly powerful. A believable story repeated again and again. For years, the Flight 914 story remained relatively obscure. But the rise of the internet gave the legend a second life. Websites, blogs, UFO forums, and conspiracy pages began sharing it as if it were a genuine mystery. Many posts removed the original newspaper's context. Instead of saying, "This was a fictional story," they asked, "Could this plane have traveled through time?" Soon, the story became much bigger than the original newspaper article. People began creating explanations. Some suggested a wormhole. Others claimed the aircraft had entered another dimension. Some even suggested that time itself had somehow stopped for the passengers. But there was one important problem with all these theories. They were trying to explain an event for which there was no reliable evidence. Then in 2019, the story received another massive boost. A popular YouTube video presented Flight 914 as a mysterious aviation case. Millions of people watched it. The story spread across social media once again, and with every repost, the line between fiction and fact became harder to see. But perhaps the strangest part of Flight 914 isn't the idea of time travel. It's how easily a fictional story can become accepted as history. A newspaper printed it, the internet repeated it, videos dramatized it, and millions of people believed it. So, what can Flight 914 actually teach us? Sometimes, the greatest mystery isn't what happened to the plane, it's how the story survived. By now, Flight 914 had become an internet legend. But there was another problem. The story wasn't even consistent. Different versions gave different details about what happened to the aircraft, how long it disappeared, and what happened after it supposedly returned. And when a story keeps changing every time it is retold, that's usually a warning sign. Some versions say the aircraft disappeared for 30 years. Others say it was gone for 37 years. The original newspaper story itself has also been republished with changes. The dates and details aren't always presented the same way. Yet online videos often present one version as if it were an official historical record. The legend says the aircraft was a Pan Am Douglas DC-4. That sounds believable because the DC-4 was a real aircraft used during that era. Pan Am was also a real airline, and commercial flights between American cities were completely normal. That's exactly what makes the story convincing. It uses real aircraft, a real airline, real places, and a real historical period, and combines them into an event that never happened. Researchers checked contemporary news reports and official aviation records. They couldn't find evidence of Pan Am Flight 914 disappearing in 1955. There was also no matching investigation in the U.S. Department of Transportation's historical accident records. And the aircraft photograph used to illustrate the story wasn't even a Pan Am aircraft. It showed a TWA DC-4 from around 1935. So perhaps Flight 914 doesn't need a time machine to explain it. It needs something much simpler. A fictional story. A story printed in a sensational tabloid, repeated years later, uploaded to the internet, and eventually presented to millions as a real mystery. But there is still one question left. Why are people so fascinated by stories like Flight 914? Pan Am Flight 914 had almost everything needed to become a legendary mystery. An old airplane, dozens of passengers, a disappearance, a mysterious return, and most importantly, a story involving time itself. It sounded impossible, but it also sounded just believable enough to make people wonder. What if it's actually true? One reason the story was so convincing was the use of real details. Pan Am was a real airline. The Douglas DC-4 was a real aircraft. New York and Miami were real destinations. And Caracas was a real airport location. When fictional stories use real places and real technology, they can feel much more like history than fiction. There's another reason stories like Flight 914 spread so easily. People naturally love unanswered questions. When there is no obvious explanation, our minds try to create one. Was it time travel? A wormhole? Another dimension? The less we know, the more room there is for imagination. Decades after the original newspaper story, the internet transformed the legend. In 2019, a viral YouTube video brought Flight 914 back into the spotlight. It was watched millions of times. Then other channels copied the story. Short videos turned it into a quick mystery. A plane disappeared for 37 years and came back. The more dramatic the headline, the more people clicked. But Flight 914 teaches us something far more important than time travel. A story doesn't need to be true to become famous. It only needs to be interesting, believable, and repeated enough times. And that's exactly what happened with Flight 914. But there is still one final question. If the plane never disappeared, what exactly happened to the passengers and crew mentioned in the story? For decades, Pan Am Flight 914 has been presented as one of aviation's greatest mysteries. A plane supposedly disappeared in 1955 and returned 37 years later. But after examining the evidence, the answer is much simpler. Flight 914 did not disappear. There is no credible evidence that the event ever happened. Researchers searched newspaper archives for contemporary reports of a missing Pan Am aircraft. Nothing credible was found. There was also no matching record in U.S. Department of Transportation aircraft accident investigation records from that period. For a commercial aircraft carrying dozens of people to simply disappear, the lack of an official paper trail would be almost impossible to explain. The trail eventually leads back to one source: Weekly World News. The tabloid published the Flight 914 story in May 1985. It later republished the story in 1993 and 1999. Researchers also found that the aircraft photograph used with the story was actually a stock photograph of a DC-4 wearing TWA colors. And different versions even used photographs of different men as the supposed eyewitness controller. So what about the idea that Flight 914 traveled through time? There is no evidence for that either. No radar record. No verified passenger list. No aircraft disappearance report. No confirmed landing in Venezuela. And no evidence that passengers spent 37 years inside a time portal. The time travel explanation was created to explain a story, not a documented event. So perhaps Pan Am Flight 914 isn't a story about a plane traveling through time. It's a story about how information travels through time. A fictional newspaper story became an internet legend. The legend became viral videos. And the viral videos made the legend look real. The plane never needed to disappear for 37 years. The story simply needed to survive for 37 years. And it did. This was the mystery of Pan Am Flight 914.